Good morning. Before we, just forgive me, Lord Sharma, I just have a few words to say. Before we resume our evidence for Module 4, I wanted briefly to mention Module 1. On the 18th of July 2024, I published my first report for Module 1, which examined the United Kingdom's resilience and preparedness for the COVID-19 pandemic. In the report, I set out a series of findings and recommendations which were put to the four governments of the United Kingdom government itself, and the three devolved administrations. I set a deadline of 6 months for them to respond from the date of the report's publication. Yesterday, all four governments met my deadline, and their responses have been published on the inquiry's website. I will be carefully considering all of their responses in the coming days. Thank you.
Thank you, my lady. Could the first witness today, Lord Sharma, be sworn, please?
I swear by the Gita that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Could you commence your evidence, please, by giving us your full name?
Yes, my name is Alok Kumar Sharma.
Thank you very much, Lord Sharma, for attending today and for assisting the inquiry, in part through the provision of your witness statement dated the 15th of November 2024, INQ 30474-590, the truth of which you have declared through your signature. Lord Sharma, you were the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the department, the acronym for which is BEIS, but I think is commonly pronounced BEIS, or was pronounced BEIS, between the 13th of February 2020 and the 8th of January 2021, a month or so after the commencement of the vaccine rollout programme. Lord Sharma, it may help if I simply observe that the focus of this module is not to recreate forensically what happened throughout those terrible days within your department, or to recreate the processes and the systems which were deployed to deal with the vaccination and therapeutic programs. We're focusing on learning lessons from what went well so that they can be embedded in the future, and also trying to identify what didn't go quite so well. So we're going to focus on a handful of discrete points which came within your reach in that department. Was BEIS, as it was then known, I think it's now DCIT, the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, responsible in part for industrial strategy, and that included science, research, innovation and the like?
Yes, it did.
And so was your department the department that was most closely involved in the issue of research funding?
Yes, absolutely. So BEIS basically was the department under which UKRI sat, along with a number of other bodies. So yes, indeed, we were.
I'm going to assist everybody by saying, by just observing that UKRI, is that UK Research and Innovation?
Yes, indeed.
We must try to steer away as much as we can from acronyms. The UK Research and Innovation, was that a non-departmental public body, but which happened to be sponsored by your department?
Yes, indeed.
I think it was launched in April 2018, so it had been in place for a while prior to the pandemic. Was it then, it may still be, the UK's largest public research funder? So not just health and social care, but across a vast range of research and development?
Yes, I believe so. And clearly the budgets that went for UKRI, UK Research and Innovation, came through the Department for Business.
And the budget was measured in the billions?
Yes.
There are many references in the paperwork to the valuable work done by the 7 disciplinary research councils in the United Kingdom, in particular the Medical Research Council. There's another research council called Research England. Do they fall within that framework coordinated by the UK Research and Innovation body?
I mean, I don't know the current sort of setup, but certainly funding flowed from UKRI directly to some of the councils.
There was another funding body, the National Institute for Health Research, now called the National Institute for Health and Care Research. It was traditionally headed by the chief scientific advisor, I think, in the DHSC, who was, of course, then Professor Sir Chris Whitty. Not, I should say, the government's chief scientific advisor, who was, of course, famously Sir Patrick Vallance, as he then was. And I think the chief scientific advisor in the DHSC now is Professor Lucy Chappell. But that's another funding body which focuses, does it not, on health and social care specifically. Was the funding that it provided, however, something that your department had a close eye on as well?
It isn't something that I was particularly focused on, but obviously we had the Office for Life Sciences at the time, which was a joint oversight from both the Department for Health and the Department for Business. So I suspect within the department there would have been awareness of what was being done.
And is that body one of the largest government funders of medical, public health and care research in Europe?
Yes, I believe so.
And importantly, was that body an integral part of the research call and the funding that took place in the run-up to the pandemic for the research that was going on in Oxford University under Dame Sarah Gilbert's team, which led, of course, to the AstraZeneca vector vaccine, and also research that was going on at Imperial College under Robin Shattuck.
Yes, indeed. And in fact, there was an initial, I think, £30 million fund, COVID fund, which was made available, which ultimately stood under the Department for Health in terms of being able to deploy to support research into COVID treatments.
And it's important also to recognise the work done by what's known as the UK Vaccine Network. I think that is particularly concerned with the development of vaccines and vaccine technology for infectious disease in low and middle income countries, but did it also provide significant funding for research and development projects pre and during the pandemic?
I'm not aware of precisely what level of funding that provided.
All right. Will you take it from me that it also funded Oxford University's adenoviral vaccine research and development funding, vaccine work in 2019? Could you also tell us, please, very briefly about Go Science? What is Go Science, and was that something, another area for which your department had at least indirect responsibility?
Yes, it did have responsibility for that. And Go Science was obviously the Office for Science, which was involved in scientific research and support.
And did your department also have overview of the Office for Life Sciences, which is a government body which promotes innovation, research and technology for work in the health and social care sectors?
Jointly with the Department for Health.
Jointly with the Department of Health. Thank you very much. Now, it's very well known, of course, that within your department there was instituted the Vaccine Task Force, the VTF. The position appears to have been this, that in late March 2020, the chief executive of the Bioindustry Association asked Sir Patrick Vallance whether a task force could be instituted connected to central government. And out of that came Sir Patrick Vallance's idea, and he must be permitted to take credit for this, of course, the idea of a governmental vaccine task force. And was that something that you were formally approached about in March 2020 and which you approved the same day?
Yes, I was approached on the 26th of March by Sir Patrick and also Sir Mark Walport. And the same day I wrote to them, setting out my support and my department's support for the VTF. And
so in very significant terms, your department was the father and mother of the Vaccine Task Force, and was its creation driven particularly, in fact, by a member of your department, Alexandra or Alex Jones, who was the director of Science Research and Innovation.
Yes, I mean, she played a key role.
Thank you. Could we just please have our INQ 000478917? We can see your letter to Sir Patrick Vallance, who was, as I've said, the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, and Sir Mark Woolport, former Government Chief Scientific Advisor, in fact, but who also happened to be the Chief Executive of UKRI, the BEIS-sponsored or managed funding entity. And we can see there that you refer in the fourth paragraph to Sir Patrick Vallance having outlined his plans to set up a vaccine task force and a therapeutics task force to look further into what we can do. You welcome it, you'll direct your officials accordingly, and you agree. Perhaps the most prominent feature of the vaccine task force was its external chair.
Yes.
Why was the therapeutics task force, which was also set up around about the same time, not chaired in the same way by an external head? Can you recall?
I can't, for the simple reason that obviously the decision was made fairly quickly, formally by the Prime Minister, I think on the 13th of May, that therapeutics should sit outside the remit of the Vaccines Task Force. But I can certainly tell you that I believe the reason the Vaccines Task Force worked as effectively as it did is because we did have Kate Bingham, now Dame Kate. I think she showed the right skills in terms of scientific, but also in terms of bringing her private sector knowledge into play. Secondly, I do think also it's quite important the fact that she reported directly to the Prime Minister. I think that link to the centre was very important. Secondly, we had a set of people that she was being supported by, many of them from within the civil service itself, who had a private sector experience, and that public-private partnership, I think, was vitally important. And finally, I think the VTF worked is because we were able to make rapid decisions, particularly on funding.
Just focusing for a few minutes more on some other aspects of the VTF, it's important to emphasise, isn't it, that whilst it had an external chair, its external advisory group and what in fact became the heart of the Vaccine Task Force was a combination of civil servants and external professionals.
Yes,
so it wasn't just external. There was a very significant civil service element. In particular, I think it's Director General Nick Elliott, Maddie McTurnan also were civil servants.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's important to emphasise that whilst we had Kate Bingham, who came in and did an excellent job, and we had external support, a lot of the people involved were civil servants brought in from within the different departments, and I think they played a really key role in making it a success.
And the VTF was also, as with all government departments, ministerially accountable to Parliament through your department, of course, because it was a BEIS-based body.
Yeah.
And was that one of the significant differences from the therapeutics task force as it became subsequently? Because that wasn't exclusively a BEIS body, was it?
It wasn't, and forgive me, Mr. Keith, I can't really comment on the therapeutics task force because I wasn't involved. I know the decisions that were made around how it was run, but certainly I think the fact that the VTF had a very clear mission, very focused, led by someone who's incredibly can-do, and the ability to make fast decisions, particularly when it came to funding, I think created the success for the VTF.
And so I'm driven to ask perhaps a fairly obvious question, Lord Sharma, which is this, is if one recognises that the most prominent features of the VTF were its ability to work at faster pace, its external expertise, the right combination of civil service experience and external professionalism, and its can-do approach, firstly, why aren't other bodies promulgated within the government machinery in the same way, and why wasn't some of the other comparable bodies like the Therapeutics Task Force set up in the same way?
Yeah. Well, I think that is actually a key lesson that I think we should be learning is, what were the ingredients that made the VTF a success? And if, God forbid, we should face another similar emergency, whether other similar bodies should be constituted in the same way.
Could we just look then briefly at just a couple of the most important documents from around this time? INQ 000533814. Thank you. Dated the 2nd of April. It's a formal BEIS submission to you, the Secretary of State, as well as your fellow ministers. And the summary states plainly that you'd asked Sir Patrick Vallance to establish a cross-government vaccine task force. If we could just look at page 2, paragraph 6, we can see there the strands of work which you had directed be carried out: supporting discovery of potential vaccines, preparing the UK to offer itself as an expert clinical testing site, reviewing the regulations, develop funding operational plan, and build on the UK's research and development expertise. I want to ask you about the second bullet point, the expert clinical testing site. Why, when a government is reaching out into the industrial sphere and seeking to bring manufacturers on board to research, develop and manufacture vaccines, is it so vital to be able to offer those manufacturers, as well as the British public, proper, well-funded, developed clinical testing sites? Why is the need for a proper platform to test vaccines so critical to the willingness of manufacturers to engage?
Yeah. Well, I mean, clearly, for any pharmaceutical treatment, it needs to go through a testing process through a number of phases, and that does involve, having those clinical trials, and therefore making sure that you are organised for that clinical testing ahead of vaccine compounds being available was vitally important. That plus, obviously, the issue on manufacturing, which was, again, something that we spent quite a lot of time thinking about and actually putting money behind.
And we'll come back to that later. Why can't manufacturers do their own testing in their own sites, perhaps abroad? Why is it so important that the United Kingdom as a country can assist with that process?
Well, I think there was clinical testing with a number of vaccines that were used abroad.
There was, yes.
As well. So I think it's not as an exclusive thing for the UK, but certainly from my point of view, and I don't claim to be an expert on sort of clinical testing, but from my point of view, I think the pace at which you can get things done, the ability to have oversight over that, I suspect is probably easier if you're doing that domestically, and for the government to be able to help direct that, and particularly build a population of people who are willing to volunteer to be part of the clinical testing. That's something that we did, and I think people did respond to that in the population.
And there was, in fact, a vaccine registry.
Indeed.
And people were allowed to sign up for it, and very large numbers of people did.
Yes,
I
mean, hundreds of thousands signed up.
Of course, the making available of vaccines was the primary objective for the Vaccine Task Force, but there were two other objectives, were there not? Firstly, to provide vaccines globally, to provide global assistance, and also to build up resilience within the United Kingdom for the future. On that second point, global assistance, could we have INQ 000533814? Page 2. I think we've gone to the same document.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that's my mistake. Could we have 330577? So that's 3 zeros, 330577. Thank you very much. This is a reference. This contains a reference to a meeting with the Prime Minister, and I want you please to emphasise that the government's direction, very strongly and personally driven by the Prime Minister, was not just about providing vaccines for the United Kingdom and for its population. He was extremely concerned that the whole world be immunised as quickly as possible, hence the second objective of the Vaccine Task Force. And we can see there in the last paragraph, he has a profound and deep-rooted aim that the world be immunised as quickly as possible. So it wasn't a nationalistic and individual country approach wasn't being taken here. There was a much wider agenda.
Yeah. No, absolutely not. And I think it was very important that the UK participated in COVAX, the COVAX facility. It participated in some of the other initiatives through the World Health Organization and others. If we think about the negotiation on the AstraZeneca vaccine, for instance, huge credit to AstraZeneca for providing that effectively at cost. And so absolutely, from our point of view, yes, we wanted to ensure that we were making vaccines available to support the population of the United Kingdom, but also to make sure that we were able to support people in other countries.
The Vaccine Task Force, in a formal recommendation in December 2020, recommended in future the creation of a national vaccines agency, and Dame Kate in her own book has promoted that recommendation, as indeed have a number of other people. A vaccine agency that would do largely what the Vaccine Task Force did so successfully, but provide an end-to-end governance. That's to say, being responsible for supply chain readiness, research and development, transfer and stockpiling, clinical trials, all the way up to the point of delivery, which obviously is for each of the devolved administrations and England. Do you support that proposition, that recommendation?
Well, I certainly think it's worth giving quite a lot of thought and consideration. I guess it depends precisely what the remit of such an organisation is and how it docks into government. I mean, I think one of the benefits of having the VTF is, yes, it had oversight, but we brought in external people, but it very clearly docked into government, and particularly when it came to funding decisions, it was important that it was close to the centre, and also I think it was understood that the VTF would at some point its life would come to an end. It would morph into something else. So I guess that the question for me is that if you have a national vaccines agency, what I don't think you would want is for it to eventually become business as usual.
It needs to be different.
It needs to be different. And I think what the VTF brought was that sense of urgency and national mission, which everyone was driving towards. So I think you'd give it some thought. I mean, one of the things that I've set out in my statement, Mr. Keith, is perhaps a precursor to this is to have an external advisory body which combines external experts, actually perhaps some of the folks who worked on the VTF, plus ministers and civil servants, meeting on a regular basis throughout the year and actually scanning the horizon for what are the risks from a health point of view, and then effectively doing an audit and looking at whether the UK actually has the capability to be able to deal with those external threats. Certainly from my point of view, I think that's one of the things that I would like to see.
And, well, I'm sorry to interrupt.
I'm so sorry.
Yesterday, I think it was Mr. Hancock who questioned the need for a separate agency, because he said it's really be the task of the UK HSA. Had you thought about whether a separate agency or a separate advisory body would be necessary in addition to the UK HSA? I do hate acronyms, but anyway, that's why Mr. Keith told you not to use them. Had you thought about whether the UK HSA could provide this advisory body and perform the task that?
Well, I mean, potentially, but I think from my perspective, the issue here is that how do you ensure that we have readiness the next time something like this happens, and This is why I talk about the fact of having an external advisory body, which then effectively provides advice into some of the established organisations and provides perhaps oversight on making sure that they are working. I think it's definitely worth thinking about whether you create a national vaccines agency. But for me, the issue is that if that just becomes a business as usual type organisation, the pace that I think the VTF brought perhaps wouldn't necessarily be there.
If I may, it may be that by asking you whether you were to promote a national vaccines agency, I premise the question on perhaps a false basis, which is that such a new body would be an entirely governmental body, a quango, a departmental body. What you're saying, in essence, Lord Sharma, appears to be that the essential feature of the VTF must be maintained, which is that it has that external element in it, and the external professionalism can do pace of response whilst remaining ministerially accountable still to Parliament.
Yes, but I also think what's important is that whoever leads that body, that advisory group, should be able to report directly into the Prime Minister of the day. I think that's one of the things that we saw from the VTF is that direct report from Kate Bingham into the Prime Minister was actually very important.
In her book, Dame Kate makes a number of wider recommendations relating to the working of government. And if I may, I hope you'll forgive me, could I just put some of the essential elements of what she suggests about the benefits and demerits of working with Whitehall and see whether you've got any observations on them. She says that she encountered too great a focus in Whitehall on procedures and process and not outcomes. There was a culture of underperformance, rapid rotation in staff, a failure to give prominence to STEM graduates, that's to say, persons expert in maths and the sciences, and the whole system of recruitment and civil service staffing requires a very good look at it. In the context, I should say, of something as specific and as perhaps scientific as vaccines and therapeutics.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I would say is that many of those people who worked on the VTF were existing civil servants.
I know I've put that to you, yes.
And some of them brought external skills as well in terms of negotiations, in terms of project management, and I think that was important. I think some of the points that she raises around more STEM graduates in the civil service, I think she makes the point that there should be more ministers who have STEM backgrounds. I think that's important. I think she talks about outcomes rather than sort of process. I think all of that is there, but we could have a long discussion about the potential ways of improving civil service. But specifically when it came to the VTF, yes, of course, there were occasions where you would have wanted things to perhaps move faster, and certainly she's very clear in her book that she did. But ultimately, I did not feel that the VTF and the decisions we were making, ultimately, particularly when it came to funding, were in some way impeded by the civil service as it is. I think she talks about the fact that one of the reasons the VTF worked is because there was a venture capital mindset. And actually, I think that she's absolutely right about that. And yes, perhaps we should have more of a venture capital mindset in government. But clearly, what you don't want is everyone in government have a venture capital mindset, because you're talking about public money, you're talking about accountability, and ultimately, I don't think that despite some of those frustrations, there were delays in terms of getting things done.
It's very clear that one of the primary drivers for the VTF's success was that their approach to procurement was at risk.
Yes.
By which I mean they were prepared to tie the government into paying in advance for manufacturing capacity in advance of the clinical trials. And that obviously couldn't have been done without the express assent of yourself, your ministers, your fellow ministers, and the Prime Minister. And it's obvious that not every, as you say, not every government department can purchase at risk, and it's an extremely dangerous process. But it worked for the VTF. Do you know whether or not that same mindset was equally applicable to the therapeutics task force, in relation to which some have said, well, it didn't have quite such a can-do approach? The same principal position wasn't taken at the start in relation to the purchase and manufacture of therapeutics.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Well, forgive me, I genuinely cannot answer that question because, I had some involvement in therapeutics through the phase 2 trials on
Yes.
board. But in terms of the running and the workings of the therapeutics task force, that wasn't something that, I had any oversight over or frankly involvement in. But if I may just add,
please,
Mr. Keith, this issue of doing things at risk, I do think that was very important. And I think that was one of the successes of both the VTF, but actually also the recognition within government and the Treasury that things needed to be done at risk. At the end of the day, we had a funding envelope of 5.23 billion. I know there were frustrations in terms of it taking a few weeks to sort of get established, but again, I think relative to business as usual, agreeing a 5.23 billion funding envelope, things actually moved really pretty fast.
It was a remarkable structure, was it not?
Yes, it was.
You were part of the ministerial panel. The draft terms of reference we can have up, please, on the page, on the screen, 000330584. Page 1 at paragraph 2, the panel of which you were part was obliged to provide commercial and financial approvals for any vaccine procurement contracts over 150 million. So anything over that amount had to be agreed to by yourself and your colleagues. Anything under had to be agreed to, of course, by the civil servants in BEIS and the Vaccine Task Force. And, of course, you're all responsible to Parliament for this public expenditure. I think your panel met 8 times between August and December 2020, so at a very rapid pace. Is that why you say it wasn't business as usual?
Yes, it met 8 times, I think the first time on the 27th of August and the last on New Year's Eve, 31st of December 2020, and bringing together senior ministers around the table, I think was really important in terms of that rapid decision-making. And I think that was, in terms of sort of funding decisions up until that point, there were some sort of big numbers, but not at the scale that needed to be made decisions on when it came to procurement of the actual vaccines. And I think it was understood by everyone that actually we needed to have a slightly different system to make this work. So actually bringing together the Treasury, the Cabinet Office, obviously the Department of Health, and the Department for Business. I chaired that Ministerial Investment Panel, and I think that again is one of the innovations that we should be thinking about for the future. Is that if we face similar type of emergency, whether right from the start in terms of making funding decisions, we should have all the key departments, but particularly the Treasury and the Cabinet Office being part of that decision-making process.
And that feature to which you refer of having the Treasury in that body means, of course, that they get hanged with the joint petard. That you have them on board agreeing to this as part of the ministerial panel review process, as opposed to forcing BEIS and the Vaccine Task Force to have to go to the Treasury on a case-by-case basis separately and ask for permission to spend vast sums of money one after the other.
Yes, and initially, obviously, we did it on a case-by-case basis, and I don't recall that there were any particular delays in terms of getting agreement on that funding. But as I said, I think it was recognised that when it came to these very, very large funding decisions, we needed to find a more efficient way of doing this.
Another aspect of this vast public expenditure, which is of public interest, is the issue of indemnities.
Yes.
Because, of course, all the manufacturers understandably sought indemnities of one sort or another. They were being forced at pace to produce vaccines for the benefit and welfare of every government and every person in the world. They all initially, I think, sought full statutory immunity, that is to say, a complete bar to being sued, which by and large is the position in the US, where there's an act, the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, which provides a very wide cutout or exemption from liability. UK ministers successfully pushed that away. Is that right?
We did, and I mean, I think it was actually recommendations by the officials, and we very much accepted that, that at the end of the day, from a taxpayer perspective, it made much more sense for individual companies to come to us with their asks rather than us giving statutory immunity. And anyway, I think giving statutory immunity would have required effectively an act of Parliament. And so that was resisted. And what it also allowed us, the negotiating to do, is, of course, there was sort of common indemnities given for the vaccine manufacturers, but there was an ability, as a result of going down the indemnity route, to have some variations as well, and that did happen. I think that was very positive.
And so that we're absolutely clear about this, the indemnities that were agreed on a case-by-case basis with each individual manufacturer by the government in no way prevented anybody from bringing a claim against a particular manufacturer, not least under the Consumer Protection Act. The indemnity didn't and doesn't prevent access to the court, and in the event of a claim being brought, it is the manufacturer who is the defendant.
Yeah, it's precisely right. That, Mr. Keats.
So the indemnity took effect, in fact, simply by way of an after-the-event willingness on the part of the government to pay for the manufacturer any award of damages made against it, as well as any legal costs.
Yes,
in certain circumstances.
Yes, in certain circumstances. I mean, there were a number of carve-outs that were in place.
We won't go there, but it wasn't a blanket, we're going to pay the check agreement. It was, we'll pay any award of costs, any award of damages, but only if the courts order it, as well as legal costs, and only in certain circumstances, or at least not in all circumstances.
Yes, that is absolutely right. And I just add one other point on this, is that
Please.
Obviously there was work done in terms of looking at the contingent liability for government as a result of giving these indemnities. There was also work done on what was the net benefit of having vaccines being deployed successfully. And clearly the net benefit calculation showed that it was many multiples higher than the potential contingent liabilities.
But by that, do you mean this, that because you're dealing with public funds, the government was obligated to weigh up the potential contingent cost of picking up the tab for a manufacturer who loses in the court and weigh it against the overall financial advantage to the United Kingdom by having a vaccine or vaccines and a delivery programme?
Yes, and I think this issue first emerged, and I set this out in my statement, I think when we were looking at reservations for Pfizer-BioNTech, and I was presented with a calculation in terms of the contingent liability for the government, and I asked for that to be revised and for more work to be done so that we could be certain in terms of exactly what we were looking at, because that initial calculation was actually a very large range. But
it must have been an extremely difficult task to try to quantify the financial worth to the United Kingdom of having a successful vaccination programme. I mean, that's not a straightforward task.
No, it's not a straightforward task, but I think as the contingent liabilities were revised as a result of more information from the Department of Health, knowing that certain groups were initially not going to be getting the vaccine, I think that helped in terms of the contingent liabilities piece. And yes, I think the range in terms of the net benefit for the UK was actually pretty large range. But nevertheless, even at the lowest level, it showed that there was a net benefit of very many multiples compared to kind of the maximum exposure when it came to indemnities for the government.
The net benefit to the United Kingdom financially and societally vastly outweighed any possible contingent liability that might ever be owed.
Yes, absolutely.
To a manufacturer.
Absolutely.
Right. And those indemnities were agreed at the highest level. They went to the Prime Minister. They were agreed on a case-by-case basis, and no doubt they were the product of a great deal of thought. Do you consider that the UK government was over-generous in its general approach to indemnities?
No, I think we were very pragmatic, and I think the negotiating team deserves a lot of credit for this because they did push back very hard on this statutory immunity, which frankly, a lot of the manufacturers, particularly as you said, Mr. Keith, they were used to that in the US through the PrEP Act. They were very keen to push, but I think the team did a great job in resisting that.
There was a paper produced for you in August 2020, the 27th of August, INQ 000478999. If we could just have page 1, please, firstly. You were being invited to reconfirm your acceptance of the general approach to government indemnities and, in fact, to note where things had reached in relation to the draft AstraZeneca supply agreement. And we can see there in the first paragraph the reference to statutory immunity or government-backed indemnities, which, as you say, the UK government negotiated its way away from. We can see in paragraph 2 the reference to the US Act, which gives very wide-ranging immunity. If we could go over the page to page 2, we can see there, under likely costs, some of the thinking relating to the contingent liability figure to which you've already spoken. Mm-hmm. And we can see that there was obviously a range of benefits or a range of worst-case scenarios. Could we then go over the page to page 3, where I think there's a reference to, yes, paragraph 12. Ministers are invited to note that the DHSC is reviewing the UK Vaccine Damage Payments Act, which is the, as you know very well, the statute that provides for the vaccine damage payment scheme, a non-compensatory flat rate scheme for 60% disablement or more. There's a reference there to officials considering options to expand the list of vaccines and to review the eligibility criteria. Yep. Do you happen to know what happened to that review and also to the possibility that appears in the line below to a separate compensation, and that's an important word, compensation scheme, not just a payment scheme for vaccines?
Yeah. I think as it sets out, this was ongoing work between the Department for Health and the Treasury. I mean, as I understand it, and please forgive me, I mean, obviously I left at the beginning of January from my post.
You did.
But as I understand it, obviously COVID-19 as a condition was inserted into the Vaccine Damages Payments Act. I think the amount of compensation sort of stayed the same. But certainly, I think one of the things that, reflecting on this, and particularly I think seeing some of the testimony on the impact film for this module, I certainly think there is a case for us to look again at both eligibility criteria, but also perhaps to look at the quantum of money that would be made available through this mechanism.
Thank you. That's
obviously for the future.
Yes, and of course it's something that would ministers would have to agree to, and it's also, of course, it has a statutory, a parliamentary foundation. On an entirely separate subject, could I ask you please about the Vaccine Manufacturing and Innovation Centre, VMIC? You've referred to the importance of having a proper developed onshore manufacturing capacity in the United Kingdom, so that in the event of a future pandemic, there is a ready, available, ready-to-go system for the manufacture of vaccines, of course, therapeutics, all the ancillary materials and substances, is it fill and finish and fill process, as well as particularly antibodies. Your department had funded to a very considerable extent VMIC, along with the UKRI and the DHSC. Could we have, please, 000506 819? Thank you very much. We can see there a reference to VMIC. In the paragraph 15, a reference to the original funding, 69 million. And then further down, thank you very much, and then in paragraph 16 and following, references to the expectation that there would be extra capacity, that the centre would be built, it would be open by June 2021, and then in paragraph 19, further costings and further funding which might be required. You asked for further detail of what was likely to happen and what was likely to be sought by way of funding, and you received a further submission. And in December, you were asked to approve in principle another 50 million or so.
Yeah, 47, yeah.
47.6 million. Was that something that you approved, or was that decision on funding taken by another of your ministers?
So I think at that point, I delegated that to Nadeem Zahawi, who was ultimately the vaccines minister in terms of deployment. But clearly I supported it. I thought it was very important that we build up manufacturing capacity, not just to deal with vaccine manufacturing during the pandemic, but obviously permanently for the future as well. And Mr. Keith, you showed me that email from Emily Bainan earlier from Number 10, as the Prime Minister's private secretary, and that very clearly referred to the role, some of the roles of the VTF was to build up manufacturing and R&D.
It's a matter of public record that the VMIC facility was sold. In fact, it was a separate entity. Its board decided that, due in fact, in the main to market conditions, it simply wasn't a going entity anymore. And the best way to proceed was to sell itself to an overseas international commercial company to try to recapitalise the structure. It had obviously had by then a great deal of public money. Is it your position that it is vital that that manufacturing capacity is maintained for the future, that these centres are ready to go, and that they are available at literally a moment's notice to turn their manufacturing capacity to the production and manufacture of vaccines and therapeutics?
Yes, absolutely right. I agree with that entirely. And if I may just reflect on VMIC, it was obviously manufacturing, but also an innovation centre. And by the end of this sort of process, the government had invested £200 million in this facility. Clearly, in the autumn of 2021, the directors decided that it should be sold, and it was sold earlier on in 2022. But of course, as I understand, it was then effectively mothballed, and obviously, I was not part of the decision in selling it. If I had still been in post, I would certainly have asked a lot of searching questions as to whether or not it was right to sell this. But just reflecting on this, I think the question for me is that, the advantage of VMIC was that there was government involvement, government investment, Innovate UK had oversight, so we could, to use your words at a moment's notice, turn to that facility in terms of manufacturing. And the question for me is, if not VMIC, then what now if we face a similar emergency tomorrow? And
so that we understand the position, Lord Sharma, there are obviously a number of different angles and aspects to the manufacture and production of vaccines and therapeutics. But at the time of the pandemic, there was a biomedical facility at Oxford. Mm-hmm. There was a production line run by a company called Wockhart in Wrexham, which provided vaccines. There was a vaccines site in Braintree. All this had to be stood up, to use a terrible expression, from scratch, funded at vast expense and very quickly indeed, in order to be able to provide the manufacturing capacity which was so sorely needed.
Yes. And I think in terms of Oxford Biomedica, I mean, certainly one of the questions I asked when we got this submission on VMIC, which showed that, it could be up and running a year earlier than envisaged, so, middle of 2021, I did ask, what could be done more immediately to get manufacturing going. And I think the solution, which was, I think, already being worked on, was to move VMIC equipment and staff into Oxford Biomedica's facilities, so basically in those clean rooms, and they were used for manufacturing, I think, AstraZeneca vaccines during that period. And just reflecting one more point, I think you made this issue about not just vaccines but also antibodies. During this period, I also approved funding to acquire a manufacturing capacity abroad for antibody therapies, and I certainly reflected at the time that actually, why is it that we didn't have this capacity in the UK? And I think that should be another learning from this, is that not just the manufacturing of vaccines, but also, as you said, fill and finish, but in addition, antibodies. If we needed this tomorrow, could we actually do this in our own country?
That was, I think, a submission dated the 24th of June 2020, was that the antibody manufacturing capacity at the Lonza Biologics site, which was abroad.
Yes, I think there were two. So there was an initial funding ask for the AstraZeneca antibody, and then I think there was a further ask in terms of Lonza, both of which were given approval.
Thank you. The final topic, please, is Evusheld. As you've rightly told us, you left the department in January 21, and therefore you were only in post during the first part of the Evusheld story, which concerned the advance purchase, or the prospect of the advance purchase. Evusheld is a therapeutic, a medicine, which can be used prophylactically in advance of infection.
Indeed.
I think described rather wonderfully by Dame Kate as immunity in a syringe, as well as, of course, used to treat people who've become infected and ill. And in May 2020, you received a submission concerning whether or not there should be a decision to, in principle, buy a very large number of doses of Evusheld for its use prophylactically. And discussions proceeded following your approval. There was a non-binding letter was agreed, a letter of intent, and by the winter of December 2020, the VTF was on the cusp of putting to ministers and the ministerial panel an agreement to actually pay money in advance for the production of Evusheld. You left office, as I said, in January 2021. Were you aware of what happened to the Evusheld advance purchase thereafter?
Not at the time, but obviously in preparation for this inquiry, I have looked into that. If I may just sort of say that in terms, actually, I think the compound was not referred to as Evusheld at the time. I think it was AZD 7442, something like that.
It was, and
yes.
I think it was also called Project Astronaut.
Exactly, Project Astronaut. I think for me, what was very important in agreeing to that submission and the signing of a letter of intent with AstraZeneca was this was a treatment which was going to support the clinically vulnerable who wouldn't otherwise be able to take a vaccine. I think that was very important for me. And I mean, you talked about Dame Kate's description. In the submission, it was very clear that this could potentially provide protection within 24 to 48 hours of being administered. And I saw a great deal of advantage in that. And as I said, it was supported by Dame Kate, but also the BIA. And initially, I think it was 1 million doses that were being proposed. Obviously, as I understand, we did actually sign this non-binding letter of intent, and the discussion continued. Ultimately, I don't think regulatory approval came through until spring 2022, so long after I had gone. Indeed. But certainly the last discussion I had on this was at the Ministerial Investment Panel on the 18th of December, where there was effectively a report in to ministers which said that the CMO had reflected on this particular issue and in terms of the purchase, rather than a million, perhaps the maximum level should be 500,000 because vaccines were being rolled out. But it was still very clearly, there was an agreement that this should be purchased to support the clinically vulnerable. And I think that was important. As I've said, I wasn't part of the ultimate decision, and there were the Department of Health had experts who pronounced on why it shouldn't be purchased. But again, for me, I think if I'd been part of that decision, I would certainly have asked, so what is the alternative treatment that is available to those who are clinically vulnerable if we're not going to buy the AZ treatment?
If I may say so, you're absolutely right. In particular, the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Chris Whitty, produced an advice on the 10th of February 2021 in which he recommended against the advance purchase. And he referred, as you say, not just to whether or not there was doubt about the degree of clinical effectiveness, but most importantly, the fact that the vaccine program had started. Therefore, there was an issue about whether or not the need for prophylactic therapeutic was as great as it had been previously, and also doubts about the level of benefit that Evusheld would bring about. But the principal point underpinning that approach was, of course, that there was a debate about the efficacy of Evusheld, whereas in relation to vaccines, the decision had been taken generically to purchase in advance at risk without knowing anything about whether or not the vaccine was even possible. So it does appear on its face as if a different approach was being taken generically to the purchase of therapeutics.
I think the difference with vaccines was, you're absolutely right, Mr. Keith, that yes, we were purchasing at a risk, but many of those candidates that we were basically putting reservation orders on, vaccine candidates, were already in trials. And if you think from the date that the VTF was launched to the first vaccine being administered, I think it was an 8-month period. So there was an understanding that the vaccines were coming and testing was going on. In the case of Evusheld, I don't think phase 1 testing started actually until late autumn in 2020. And I think initially, as I remember from the submission, it had been expected that this treatment might actually be available by late autumn 2020. So I think that may have been one of the reasons why a decision wasn't felt to be imminent, because we still weren't clear in terms of the efficacy and the testing going through the different phases.
I understand. As it happened, you led an oversight group. You led the oversight group on what was called the Accord phase 2 trial process. So in this pantheon of phases from phases 1 to 4, this was phase 2. Could we have INQ 000478978 up, please? Before the inquiry, there are a number of witness statements from Professor Sir John Bell, Jeremy Farrar, Professor Sir Jonathan Van Tam, amongst others, who say that in relation to this issue of the phase 2 trial, coordination by the UK government and the funders and the academic institutions which were concerned in these trials, there was a lack of coherent management. There were a lot of underpowered phase 2 trials. There was a problem with recruitment. There appeared to be quite a high measure of discord as to who was going to get what funding, who was going to run each of the trials. And Sir John Bell says the process became overly complex, not effectively coordinated or organised. And he describes how there were meetings with you, or perhaps in advance of meeting you in the department, in which the advisory group held their corporate heads in their hands because of the complexities of this process. In this document, headed Accord New Wave of Trials, your officials refer to a meeting that you were going to have with Sir Mark Woolport, CEO of UKRI, Jeremy Farrar, the well-known industrialist and scientist, Sir John Bell, who was intimately involved in the vaccine task force, the therapeutics task force, and Jonathan Van Dam, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. And they're discussing, or you're intending to discuss, proposals for the coordination of the new wave of COVID-19 therapeutic trials and the establishment of a new single delivery framework. And over the page, we can see some handwritten notes, which we think are yours. Are they yours?
They're mine, yes, indeed.
Noise with Accord, very unhelpful. Recovery, that's a reference to what was an extremely successful phase 3 trial, Recovery. Same program, something, I think it may be same program or similar program.
Single program.
Single program.
Forgive my handwriting.
No, well, that's quite all right. You've been good enough to write everything in capitals, so that's helped us a great deal. There's a reference to funding and NIHR, the National Institute for Health Research. And then you say on the far right-hand side of the page, sit in BEIS. So is this the position that it was apparent by the summer of 2020 that there were going to be, well, there were problems concerning the coordination and management of this particular but really important part of the clinical trial process, and in particular its funding and constitution? Do you know whether or not the problems you identified were ever resolved? Because it doesn't appear as if they were.
Yes, so firstly, just in terms of these notes, I think I would describe them as sort of absent-minded doodles during the call of the 22nd.
Lord Sharma, you don't need to justify them.
But I think it's important to set out that this is basically what I was being told on the call. And if you look at the initial summary, it talks about what the oversight should be, etc. But I think it's important to set out the history a little bit on this, Mr. Keith, which is that I think there was some sort of questions in terms of where the phase 2 trials should sit in the first place, and this was a discussion that started in March. Ultimately, I think Sir Mark Woolport was keen that they sat under the UK Research, UKRI, and I was and this Accord programme was formed on the 14th of April. I was first sort of made aware of all of this was when I was approached by Number 10 towards the end of April to request that I chair this oversight board, because clearly there were issues and they wanted someone to sort of come and at least try and bring some coherence to this. We had the first oversight board meeting on the 27th of April, and I think you're absolutely right. The issues became clear in terms of things not working sort of fairly early on. And one of the key issues, as you identified, was around, not just coordination, but also all of that leading to not enough patients coming into the clinical trials.
The recruitment issue.
And I think, during that period of May, I think it wasn't as if people were sort of standing still. There were lots of plans being worked up in terms of how you get more patients, how you expand the hospital sites where you recruit patients. And I was told that there were two key issues. One is that hospitalization rates from COVID were dropping, which generally is a very good thing. But obviously, if you're looking to do this kind of clinical testing, that presents an issue in terms of the population that you can access. And secondly, that there was effectively a sort of competition with some of the phase 3 trial phases as well. I remember asking, and I think it says this in the minutes, on the 11th of May, we had very regular meetings of this oversight group. On the 11th of May, I think the minutes show that I asked very clearly a number of times of all the experts around the table, is there anything else that they wanted government to do to fix this issue? And I was told at the time that actually things were in play. It would sort of resolve itself. But I think, towards the end of May, it was very clear it wasn't going to. And I think at the start of June, I then contacted 10 Downing Street and suggested that we needed to find a different way of doing things. And that ultimately then resulted in this meeting on the 22nd, bringing the key parties together. And I think there is an email you will find from my statement, which my private office sent to number 10 Downing Street on the 25th of June, which set out that I had managed to gain consensus from all of these individuals who experts in their own rights and obviously a different set of personalities.
Are you about to say it's herding cats?
Well, I would never describe something like this as sort of herding cats. I mean, these were experts, and they had differing views. But I think the point is that by the end of June, we had reached a consensus that this needed to be rolled into the recovery trials, and that's what happened.
Thank you very much. That's extremely clear. Lord Sharma, those are all the questions I have for you, but there are a number of questions from, as my lady will tell you, the court participants.
Mr. Thomas, it's over there, Lord Sharma.
Good morning, Lord Sharma. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
In October 2020, your department published a press release entitled, sorry, forgive me, Lord Sharma, I should introduce myself. I'm representing FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. I do apologise. Yeah. In October 2020, your department published a press release titled Ethnic Minority Communities and the Elderly Called Upon to Bolster the Fight Against the Coronavirus. The release went on to say that researchers were specifically calling on more people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds to take part in clinical trials for vaccines, noting that they were underrepresented at the time, despite being disproportionately affected by COVID, and at that time, only 7% of volunteers were from ethnic minority groups. A further report from the Vaccine Task Force in December 2020 showed that little progress had been made by the December and stated that only 8% were from ethnic minority groups, which does not reflect UK demographics. Lord Sharma, do you accept that there has been a long-standing issue with ethnic diversity within clinical trials that remains unresolved?
Firstly, thank you for that question. And I think you're absolutely right, is that there was underrepresentation in the trials from the range of ethnic minority communities. And you talked about the percentages that there were, and that percentage is obviously, I think half of what the actual proportion of ethnic minority communities in the United Kingdom is. At the time, I think there was effort made from the VTF and others in terms of messaging to ensure that we try to get a clinical trial cohort which is representative of the UK population. Clearly, as you set out in the figures, that didn't happen. And I think one of the learnings that we should take from this is that how in future we fix this issue. Now, we had a registry at the time. There is a new registry that is, I think, administered by the NIHR, the Department of Health. And I think one of the things that we should be thinking about is how, as time goes on, we try and find a way of connecting with ethnic minority communities and other groups that were somehow underrepresented in those clinical trials.
Can I come on to that? I
Yes,
just want to piggyback on what you've just said, yes. Because during the course of this week, we've heard a lot of evidence so far in relation to historical mistrust amongst certain communities, how certain communities have been left behind. And so I suppose the follow-up question is this. Given the fact that there was mistrust within certain communities and other barriers to participation, how were these being addressed?
I just want to reflect on the impact film, and I think it was particularly powerful where we had a doctor who was from the ethnic minority community who talked about the fact that she obviously, as a doctor, encouraged people from the community to take up the vaccine, but also was someone who was then volunteering to administer vaccines. And I think there was a discussion as well in the impact film that mosques were used as centres for vaccination, and that provided a lot of confidence. And I think, in terms of getting more people from ethnic minority communities as part of that clinical trial registry for the future, I think we need to think about how we do that outreach now, in terms of going into those communities and explaining to them, why it's important for them, for their children, for the community, and the wider population in the UK, that they are part of, this kind of process going forward.
Okay. Can I move on to my next question, which is this? We would quite like to know, what steps did you personally take and or oversee to increase representation and diversity in these trials for the COVID vaccines and therapeutics?
Well, obviously, I was a part of the information that went out in terms of press releases. Ultimately, I had responsibility through some of the work that the VTF was doing in terms of disseminating information around this issue. But it was a really challenging time, and I think we all sort of understand that. And in a way, this is the sort of work that we ought to be doing now, rather than necessarily in the heat of the moment, where I think people tried very hard to try and make sure that we had a representative cohort within the clinical trial. So I don't think it was for want of trying, but I think you talked about building trust. That's something that needs to happen now, not in the middle of an emergency.
Yeah. Lord Sharma, I agree for what it's worth, but can I just add this? Bearing in mind that there was historically a lot of mistrust beforehand, do you have any idea why that trust hadn't been built beforehand?
Forgive me, I can't sort of comment on the work that was done in prior years when obviously I wasn't in post. But as we heard from Mr. Keith and the chair, this is about lessons and learnings for the future. So I think this is, for me, this is one of the key learnings as well, is to make sure that we can stand up a clinical trial platform which actually does everything from sort of phase 1 onwards for the future, and making sure that we are sort of ready to go in terms of having that representative group. And that clearly needs work and proactive work, and I hope that's one of the things that will happen.
Well, you very nicely bring...
move on, Mr. Thomas.
You very nicely bring on to my final question.
Well, I think we've covered your final question. I'm really sorry.
So be it.
We're so tight for time today.
Thank you, my lady.
Mr. Wagner, where have you gone? Oh, there you are.
Thank you. Good morning, Lord Sharma. I ask questions on behalf of clinically vulnerable families. I'm just going to ask you about one area, if I may, which is prophylactics. At paragraph 77 of your statement, you've said you're not able to assess the relative prioritization of vaccines and therapeutics because your work was focused on the vaccine task force and you weren't involved in therapeutics. And you've also suggested you're not in a position to assess the overall prioritization of pre-exposure prophylactics. Now, I think you've discussed briefly with Mr. Keith Casey this morning that some prophylactics, particularly antibody treatments, were included in the remit of the vaccine task force. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely.
Given that the vaccine task force had antibody treatments in its remit and you were the chair, how is it that you, as the former chair, are not able to provide a view of the relative prioritization between vaccines and prophylactics?
Well, I think the question I was asked originally by the inquiry was the comparison between vaccines and therapeutics overall. And given that I wasn't responsible overall for therapeutics and neither for the therapeutics task force, I didn't feel able to give a view. But I think if we're sort of comparing sort of the vaccines work with the work on antibodies, I think there was clearly work done on antibody treatments to support the clinically vulnerable, and we see this in terms of the agreement to fund for what became known as Evusheld. So I think there was thought going into this, and I think Dame Kate particularly was very keen when there was a sort of division of labour in terms of what the VTF should be responsible for. I think I remember from the time, and the records very clearly show that she felt that antibody treatments should be part of the VTF's remit.
Although they were part of the remit, would you agree that, looking back, they sort of came underneath vaccinations in terms of the prioritization, the amount of resource, the amount of creative thought, all of that went into the two different areas?
No, I'm not. I mean, forgive me. I'm not sure that's entirely fair in the sense that there was work being done on this area, and I said, I mean, the evidence for that is the submissions that came on Evusheld and subsequently further submissions that came to me for antibody manufacturing capacity abroad as well in terms of securing that. So there was clearly a lot of thought going on this, and obviously Dame Kate, when she gives evidence, will I hope sort of say the same thing. So there was a lot of thinking going on. I think there is a wider issue which Mr. Keith raised as to what happened at the end of the day in terms of the decisions on purchasing those sort of treatments.
Particularly Evusheld. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. That completes our questions for you, Lord Sharma. I have no idea if we're going to have to ask you to help us again in any other module, but thank you so much for your help so far.
Thank you. Pleasure.
I shall return at 25 to 12. Mr. Keith.
My lady, the next witness is Clara Swinson, please.
I do solemnly,
solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
I hope we haven't kept you waiting too long, Ms. Swinson.
Not at all.
Good morning. Could we commence your formal evidence, please, by asking you to give your full name?
Yes, Clara Jane Swinson.
Thank you very much for attending today and for the enormous assistance which you and your department, the Department of Health and Social Care, have given to the inquiry. You personally, with the assistance, no doubt, of your departmental colleagues, have provided 3 very large, very long witness statements, but we're very grateful to you for them. Worryingly and terrifyingly, they are your 6th, 7th and 8th witness statements, INQ 474334, 474335 and 474333.
That's correct.
Dated all of them September last year, but they run to many hundreds or hundreds of pages. But as I say, they're extremely helpful, so thank you.
Thank you. May I just start by expressing my deepest sympathy for those who've suffered in the pandemic and continue to suffer, and indeed my thanks to all of those who've helped make the vaccine and therapeutics programmes a success.
Of course. By the metric of the need to protect at a population level against the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the evidence appears to suggest, provisionally of course, that the vaccine programme was an overwhelming success, and perhaps to a slightly lesser degree, but no less importantly, the therapeutics programme brought about great benefit. The DHSC was one of many government departments, entities, people, agencies, advisory committees who helped bring that about. And it might be said to be the centre of the web in terms of the vaccination and therapeutic story. And therefore, I'm sure you want to pay tribute to all those who contributed to that largely successful outcome, but in particular, your colleagues in your own department, who plainly worked extremely hard for a very long period of time in the aid of the United Kingdom.
Absolutely. I do, and indeed to many people, the experts, independent experts who gave voluntary of their time, and the public as well.
I want to focus today on that number of discrete but no less important issues, in respect of which one might say that it's important to embed the lessons about what went well, as well as to identify those areas that didn't work quite so well, and in respect of which it's perhaps even more important that we try to identify what can be done in the future to make that process work better. You are currently, and you have been since November 2016, the Director General for Global and Public Health at the Department of Health and Social Care.
I was since that time until September of last year. I now work for the Cabinet Office.
Congratulations.
Second Permanent Secretary and head of mission.
Correct. Yeah.
Well, I'm very sorry that I haven't reflected that in my opening gambit, Mr. Swinson. The ministers in the DHSC included, of course, Mr. Hancock, Mr. Javid, I think Helen Whately, Nadine Dorris, Lord Bethel, and a number of others. And plainly, the DHSC had a very wide remit. It was a particularly complex departmental structure, which was prayed in aid of the pandemic response. Could we just have a quick look at some of the roles that your department carried out? INQ 474334, page 7 at paragraph 18. We can see there you've identified at a very broad level the roles of your department in research and development, amending the legislation, deployment. You led the preparation for and facilitated the deployment at scale, although operationally, of course, deployment was largely for the NHS entities across the United Kingdom, as well as national public health agencies. Authorization and approval. We'll come to the process by which approval and authorization was given for vaccines later. The approach of prioritization, you commissioned and responded to the advice of the independent statutory body, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, but it gave advice to which ministers agreed largely, I think in advance, that they would agree to when given by the JCVI. International engagement and collaboration, campaigns and communications, perhaps over the page, if there are more, yes. Further down the page, vaccine security, vaccine uptake. You obviously contributed to the identification of areas where more could be done to ensure uptake and reduce barriers to access, cross-UK collaboration, interaction with other vaccine programmes, holding the health system to account, and last but by no means least, briefing ministers.
That's correct.
I think the DHSC, prior to the establishment of the Vaccine Task Force, was immediately instrumental in the early vaccine research and the clinical trial process, dealing with issues such as building capacity and considering development and manufacturing. So from the very word go, the DHSC was intimately involved in the vaccine and therapeutic story, if I may call it that.
Yes, that's correct. I think the first meetings that we had in January 2020 under the leadership of the CMO and the Deputy CMO included the need to start work on finding vaccines and therapeutics to address the new virus.
And was a new directorate, in fact, set up in the DHSC in your department to deal with the vaccines response particularly?
That's right. In the course of 2020, a new directorate on the overall battle plan, one on vaccines, one on therapeutics, and one on the non-pharmaceutical interventions that we heard a lot about. This module is also, and obviously the strategy was to find the pharmaceutical interventions of vaccines and therapeutics so we could move away from the MPIs.
And Antonia Williams, I think, took on the role of being the COVID-19 vaccine deployment director.
Correct.
And you've provided some detail about the number of staff and the officials who were concerned in the DHSC in that directorate. How many, in terms of full-time or equivalent to full-time staff, were there at various times in the pandemic in that directorate dealing with vaccines?
Yes, probably up to about 80. I don't know exactly, and about the same on therapeutics. It's varied a bit over time.
The VTF was set up, as we've heard from Lord Sharma, by BEIS, B-E-I-S. But there appeared to be some debate as to whether or not that body should be accountable to both BEIS and your department, the DHSC. And as we'll see in a moment, of course, the Therapeutics Task Force ultimately did become exclusively a DHSC-led body.
Yes.
How did that debate come about? Why did it matter in which department any particular advisory body or task force should sit?
Yes. So you're right. I mean, work on vaccines and therapeutics started from the beginning. It didn't await the setting up of the task force. On the whole, the system you've set out, people in the system did the jobs that they were already doing, but at greater scale. There were a few cases, and vaccines and therapeutics were some, where an additional organisational structure was set up because of the importance of that. There was some debate, obviously, on the, as it was right at the beginning, research and manufacturing are more in the business department at that stage, and so it was decided by the Prime Minister that the Vaccines Task Force would be part of BEIS therapeutics stage with the Department of Health and Social Care, as you set out.
So that was a prime ministerial decision ultimately. Of course, the production and manufacture of therapeutics involves the same scientific and innovative working patterns. It obviously is intimately concerned with the issue of bioresearch.
Yeah.
In hindsight, do you think that was the right course to have the Therapeutics Task Force in DHSC and to have vaccines in BEIS?
Yes, I mean, the most important thing, I think, is that they were well-resourced, they had the right expertise wherever they sat, but in setting up the Vaccines Task Force under the leadership of Kate Bingham from May 2020, making that a task that was just vaccines, not therapeutics, gave a focus to that, put therapeutics and then antivirals were given their own focus a year later. And just in terms of the steps, there's a lot to do on research. There's then a lot to do on the development of vaccines and therapeutics, then on procurement, and then on deployment. And so the task forces played their own role in some elements of that, but weren't the vaccines task force was not end to end. It really focused on the procurement, the development, and working with industry.
Why wasn't there an external head for the therapeutics task force in the way that there was plainly for the vaccine task force, whilst at the same time later there was an antiviral task force which was headed by, I think, an external head, Eddie Gray?
Correct.
How did that come about?
Yeah, well, I think at the start, whether the Kate Bingham's task force would cover both was under debate. When it was decided not to, there was some debate, and there was definitely a lot of external input to the therapeutics task force, and indeed a lot of work that Jonathan Van Tam had already, the deputy CMO, had already started. There was a lot of external input. Whether an external chair would have changed that a lot, I don't know. I don't think it made a difference to the work of the Therapeutics Task Force in its first year, which was largely set up and guided by Jonathan Van Tam, and I should have mentioned earlier, not just the CMO, but Patrick Vallance, the GCSA, who I think made the advice of the Prime Minister, both for the Vaccines Task Force and the following year for the Antivirals Task Force, that they should have an external chair.
Mr. Sharma, Swinson, it appears to be generally recognised that having an external head in the form of, as it happens, Dame Kate Bingham, was a good thing. Bringing that very visible external leadership had very significant benefits in terms of the management of the operation and the outcome of the vaccine task force. So just in principle, would that not be a sensible thing in the future to do in the event that a therapeutics task force has to be recreated?
Yeah. As I say, I think the biggest difference is that it has the right expertise. As we'll come on to, I'm sure, the Therapeutics Task Force in its first year or first few months was largely the thing that would have the biggest difference was repurposed therapeutics that already had authorization. So the task was slightly different than starting right at the beginning, where we didn't have any vaccines at all. But yes, the extent of external input, but also a voice, as you've said, is a judgment, and could have easily also had an external chair. The other task force that was set up was the testing task force with an external chair in
Lord
that year.
Dayton,
Baroness, you're right, PPE as well under Lord Dayton.
Lord Dayton for
Dido Harding.
PP and Baroness Harding for test and trace. And so that we're clear that obviously the vaccine task force had within itself very able civil servants who worked alongside the external professionals who'd been brought in.
Absolutely right.
And the therapeutics task force, was that also a combination of external professionals and scientists and industrialists and venture capitalists and civil servants?
Yes, both of them were multidisciplinary teams with commercial expertise, policy expertise. For most of the work with industry, that was done through external advisory groups rather than paid positions in the task force, but it was the same mix of experience in both.
In your statement, you have equally set out in relation to therapeutics the roles of the functions of the department. And just before I show you what you've said, what do you say to the suggestion that therapeutics, and in particular prophylactics and in particular antivirals, were given any less attention by your department than vaccines?
So from the start, with no therapeutic and no vaccine for COVID-19, both were given, the task was to find effective preventative or treatments that would mean that science, as it has for almost all pandemics, would give us a way out of the pandemic. And that could have been a vaccine or a therapeutic, or more likely a combination of both. From the start, that's what the Deputy CMO set out to do. They were both equally important. At that stage, we didn't know which it would be or what combination. And indeed, given there hadn't been a vaccine against any coronavirus, the very expert opinion thought that the chance of an effective vaccine was somewhat below 10%. So they were both very important from the start. It was unprecedented the speed of the development of the vaccine, and so by probably the late summer, autumn of that first year, 2020, it was evident that an effective vaccine was much more likely, and that did change the context, as we'll come on to, for both for other preventative treatments, because there would be an effective vaccine, but still really important to develop the therapeutics for those who were in hospital and in the community, that were both repurposed existing therapeutics and novel therapeutics, which did come the following year.
Counterintuitively and rather bizarrely perhaps, the more successful the vaccine programme was and turned out to be, on one level, the more reduced the need became for there to be therapeutics because, of course, the vaccine program in its success reduced transmission and at a population level reduced the spread of the COVID-19 virus, for which therapeutic treatment would be needed to deal with. And also, as the vaccine program began to succeed at a remarkable and at such a high level, there were fewer hospitalization cases and fewer people available and willing to have therapeutics tested on them anyway. So there was that problem built into the success of the vaccine program.
There was that impact, yes, whether it was a problem or not. The numbers that we needed for research are quite right. It's one reason why in the UK so many people are successfully enrolled in research in that first year. Of course, even the chief investigators took or carried out research both in the UK but in other parts of the world and did need people who were infected with the virus at whatever point that was in different countries. So there were various trials done in other parts of the world as they were in the UK for precisely the reason you set out.
I wasn't going to ask about trials, but you've raised a point
Yep.
which I want to just ask you about. Just a few moments ago to Lord Sharma, Leslie Thomas Casey put a question about the lack of diversity in the clinical trials for the vaccines. But of course, what hasn't perhaps been made sufficiently clear is there may have been a lack of diversity racially and ethnically in trials in the United Kingdom, where I think in very broad terms, the clinical trials for vaccines that were carried out in the United Kingdom had about a 7% ethnic minority makeup as opposed to a proper or a full reflection of the demographics of around about 13 to 15%. But all the vaccines had overseas trials as well for the same product. And in some countries, is this not right? There was up to an 80% ethnic or racial component.
Absolutely, you're correct.
Because they were conducted in South Africa,
Correct.
obviously where there's a very much a higher proportion who are black African as opposed to white British. America, South America, and elsewhere in Europe.
Absolutely. So both diversity and looking where research could be done where there were higher rates of the disease. Correct.
Thank you. I've digressed already. Bringing you back to therapeutics and your witness statement, could we have 474335 at page 7? You set out there, paragraph 18 and paragraph 19, the areas in which the department was concerned on the therapeutic side: research and development, procurement, storage and supply, funding, communications, engagement with the life sciences sector, working across the whole United Kingdom, international collaboration, briefing ministers and senior officials.
Yes.
In terms of the width, any less wide than the functions in connection with vaccines?
No, very similar. And as for vaccines, most of the wider health system and the independent regulator and so on did exactly the job that they normally do for any vaccine or therapeutic, not just C19. It was the same system. The Department of Health, because of the emergency situation, obviously was more active in many of these than it would be normally. But it's across the breadth from discovering and research into a vaccine or therapeutic now through to deployment, working with NHS England to get the treatments to the patients who needed them.
And may I just momentarily just put to you each of the key bodies which you identify in your statements, and just ask you to confirm their general, as simply as you can, their role in the general scheme of things. You're in the hot seat, Mrs. Swinson, because you were the Director General for Global and Public Health, and in the DHSC, you're obviously able to see how the system comes together. In relation to vaccines, your sixth statement, 474334, page 22, page 21, paragraph 20, you identify... I'm looking at the wrong statement.
That's okay. Public Health England?
No, it was the right reference. It's just I had the wrong physical statement in front of me. So could we have back, please, 474334, page 22. Thank you. Paragraph 70, there's a reference there to the UKHSA. The UKHSA is normally responsible for the procurement of vaccines for routine programmes. But in the specific context of the pandemic, what it and the Public Health England agencies did, as did the public health agencies in each of the devolved administrations, was provide public health advice on all aspects of vaccination. So UCSA stood back from the role of procurement, and that was largely conducted by the Vaccine Task Force within BEIS with the assistance of the DHSE. Yes?
Correct.
There's a reference to, in paragraph 71, to the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agencies. That's the UK regulator.
Correct.
Primarily responsible for authorization and licensing of both vaccines and therapeutics. Is that an entirely independent agency, independent of the rest of government?
Yes, it's an agency of the department, but it is an independent regulator, both in the way it assesses the safety, effectiveness and quality of drugs and vaccines before they come onto the market, with also the input of the Commission for Health Medicine, CHM, that advises it. And that is independent and regulates all medicines on the market in the UK.
And in terms of its independence, what's important about what happened during the pandemic is, whilst it's an executive agency within the DHSE, formally, it gave independent advice on whether or not to license, authorise every single vaccine and every single therapeutic that was licensed. And the way in which it worked was it would give independent advice, which would then be formally, if you like, decided upon by one of our ministers,
Correct.
Called the licensing minister.
Correct.
But that in no way detracts from the fact that it was absolutely for the MHRA to say whether any given vaccine or therapeutic should be authorised.
Correct. It was agreed with MHRA in the summer of 2020 that under the emergency procedure and one of the regulations that the same advice and work would be done within MHRA, but that decision would be put to a minister. We identified a different minister in the department called the licensing minister to take that decision so that it was separate from the ministers who were responsible for the supply and purchase and rollout of vaccines, so that there was no perceived conflict between those two roles.
And was the DHSC and the Office of the Chief Medical Officer, comprising obviously the CMO and the DCMOs, at pains to guarantee and ensure the continued independence of the MHRA?
That is correct, and that was set out both in the note of the meeting that I was referring to in the summer of 2020 with the then Secretary of State and the Office of the Chief Medical Officer, indeed, both for MHRA and for other independent bodies. They were obviously very interested in the progress of their work, but it was in no way took away the independence and the decisions that they recommended.
So you were constantly being informed as to progress. Right. What would have happened if those persons, civil servants and external professionals, scientists, academics, who were involved in the procurement of vaccines and therapeutics, the manufacture of vaccines and therapeutics, the purchase of vaccines and therapeutics, or their delivery had got involved in the MHRA authorization safety processes?
So it was important we had the line between those so that in their desire to get a vaccine, that none of that was influencing the proper process that MHRA took. And indeed, at the authorisation decisions, all of those, I remember at the time, were done on a very tight copy list. There were also code names for vaccines early on, so that people working on preparing the rollout did not know the exact state of the work for MHRA and the authorization that was done on an independent basis.
Another important body, of course, and we've had much of it already, was the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. If you could have page 30, please, paragraph 103. In relation to the JCVI, is this not just an independent, but in fact a statutory body?
That's correct.
So it actually isn't part of government in any shape or form. Its recommendations were, of course, concerned with prioritization.
Yes.
Not authorization, but the priority by which people would have their vaccines made available.
Correct.
And did you put into place a system in which, although the Secretary of State, in certain circumstances, is legally bound to implement recommendations from the JCVI, in the context of COVID-19, the Secretary of State agreed, because it didn't fall within those particular categories, nevertheless to give real weight to anything that the JCVI said on the issue of prioritisation.
Absolutely. The difference in this circumstance is that JCVI did not consider cost effectiveness because the vaccines had already been procured, but both the Secretary of State and indeed it went to COVID-0, the Cabinet Office chaired Cabinet Committee who agreed that they would take the advice from JCVI and implement prioritisation in the way that they recommended.
And although it wasn't a matter of the DHSC, in order to further promote the appearance and actuality of independence, the actual chair of the JCVI, Professor Sir Andrew Pollard, recused himself because he'd had some involvement in research work in Oxford. That's why Professor Wei Shen Lim took over.
Correct, for exactly that reason, and want to set out my thanks both to Professor Wei Shen Lim and all of the members of the subcommittee, which I think met pretty much twice a week and more often when needed throughout this period.
Well, I think they were on the phone to each other day and night, 24 hours a day, it would seem. Just a quick dance through the remaining bodies and areas. Page 33, paragraph 104. Once the vaccines were procured with the great assistance of the VTF for the population as a whole, at what point did the UK government step back, and at what point did the remainder of the process fall within the authority and the practical reach of the devolved administrations?
So once the vaccines arrived in the UK, they were distributed to agreed points for each of the devolved administrations, also the Crown territories, overseas territories and the Crown dependents as set out. PHE, as were responsible for the logistics of that operation. Then once it was in those places, the NHS in England and in each of the other nations were then responsible for the deployment, distribution and deployment to the vaccination centres.
And in England, it was the Secretary of State, your Secretary of State, Mr. Hancock, until July 2021, who took decisions on vaccine deployment on the advice of PH England, as AXA as it became, the NHS
Correct.
England, and the Vaccine Task Force,
Absolutely.
amongst myriad other bodies.
Yep.
And in terms of the overall coordination, page 80, paragraph 302, even though delivery, the output of vaccines was for each devolved administration, there was in the earlier parts of this remarkably complex machinery very close engagement at all levels in respect to all aspects of research, development, procurement, manufacture, clinical trial, and authorization.
That's right, across the UK. That was both done with the UK CMOs, the DCMOs at ministerial level and at policy official. There was very close working. The slightly different statutory arrangements for JCVI for each of the bits of the UK, but they all followed the same advice. And where there were lessons to learn or things about where the vaccine would be rolled out or changes, that was very regularly discussed.
And then on therapeutics, as I emphasised no less importantly, your seventh statement is largely concerned with that topic 474335, page 9, paragraph 23. You set out something of what was the antivirals and the therapeutics task force. Was that a combined entity that brought together the therapeutics task force and the antivirals task force?
It was.
In April 2022.
Correct.
There was, paragraph 24, a advisory committee called Rapid C19, which comprised a number of bodies, but most importantly, NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence.
Correct.
And a number of other bodies. And it took, to a very large extent, the decision as to what particular therapeutics would be not just investigated and pursued, but ultimately made available.
That's correct. I said that most of the system did exactly as it did before the pandemic. NICE assesses drugs and makes a cost-effectiveness judgment and asks the NHS to make them available. There was a different system so that was done faster in the pandemic, and that is chaired by NICE. Rapid C19 did a very similar job to what NICE would have done or does do in the non-emergency time, and recommend which therapeutics should be made available to the NHS.
And importantly, did Rapid C19 have membership from all the devolved nations, including
across the UK,
all the devolved administrative bodies, such as the Scottish Medicines Consortium, the All Wales Therapeutics and Toxicology Centre,
as set out here. Correct.
So that although it was a UK body, in practice and reality, as with many of these advisory committees and bodies, they included membership from across the United Kingdom, so that to a very large extent, they all became trans-UK bodies.
Yes, and had a common approach.
The MHRA you address at paragraph 30. I don't think we need to dwell on that, except perhaps 30 paragraph B. The MHRA is a UK body, is it not?
It is.
But notwithstanding, therefore, that in terms of its authority, it extends across the whole of the United Kingdom, it also is carefully linked to NICE in England, SMC in Scotland, and the AWTTG in Wales for the purposes of its recommendations.
That's correct.
There was a therapeutics clinical review panel, page 26, paragraph 87, which also played a role in the advice given to all the UK chief medical officers. So not just the Office of the Chief Medical Officer, but in fact all 4 UK chief medical officers about therapeutics. There was another body, page 27, the UK COVID Therapeutics Advisory Panel, which gave independent advice for that earlier group on the most promising therapeutics. And then, as you've described, there was the Rapid C19 process, as well as the task forces which were concerned with procurement and procurement.
Correct.
Right. What a complicated structure, Mrs. Swinson. On the funding side, we've heard a bit about the funding from Lord Sharma. We're aware, of course, of the NIHR, the National Institute for Health and Care Research, the important body, the UKRI, and also the funding done by the United Kingdom Vaccines Network.
Yep.
It's obvious that there were a number of funders. Do you assess, by reference to the speed with which decisions were made and the number of vaccine and therapeutic trials that were funded, that system of funding worked well in January, February, March, April 2020?
Yes, so on research funding, I think it did work well. I'd say two things about it. One that you've referred to is that decisions that were taken before 2020 were very important. So the base of the clinical networks and research infrastructure in the UK, and indeed relatively small amounts of investment that made a big difference into the capabilities that the UK had, and the development of the AstraZeneca vaccine at Oxford were already in place. And then when the pandemic had started, coordinating that, issuing an urgent public health call, and being able to fund and coordinate the trials in the spring of 2020 was incredibly important, and I think worked well.
Just pausing there, a great deal of research had already been done on messenger ribonucleic RNA vaccine technology. So although two, I think, of the COVID-19 UK vaccines were based on mRNA technology and were new vaccines, the technology had been around for some time and had been funded and had been gone into. Is that correct?
I think you would need someone more technical, but I think they are the first mRNA vaccines at all. So it was known as a theoretical approach to vaccines that was being developed.
But the technology and the research had been going on for some time.
That's correct.
Secondly, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine based on an adenoviral virus,
yes,
chimpanzee virus, known as a vector virus. Again, that had been in play, not obviously for the purposes of the coronavirus virus that we were dealing with, but it had been in play, the technology had been in play for a while, and that had been funded for some time already by these various elements in the United Kingdom government.
Yes, so the UK Vaccines Network was funded from our overseas aid budget. It had been established after lessons learned from the Ebola outbreak, chaired by Sir Chris Whitty. It identified viruses of pandemic or epidemic potential, particularly in low and middle income countries, and funded research into what was then a MERS. So it was a coronavirus, the coronavirus vaccine platform, which was then and had some early clinical trials, which was then able to pivot to the new coronavirus, the novel coronavirus that had been found.
Indemnities, entirely separate subject, please.
Yep.
Taking it briefly, because we've heard from Lord Sharma on the general topic of indemnities already. You were directly concerned with drafting submissions to the Secretary of State seeking authority for the general approach taken by the UK government,
Yep.
both in general terms to indemnities, but also in respect of each of the contracts.
Yep.
Was the nature and the style of the indemnity in each case negotiated with each manufacturer separately?
I believe so. It was the responsibility of the Vaccines Task Force with very significant commercial expertise. And I think it's not unusual in an emergency situation to have these types of indemnities. They advised the ministerial panel, which was the Minister for Secretary of State for Health and for Business, as well as ministers from the Cabinet Office and Treasury about those decisions. We also advised our Secretary of State, as set out, when the UK government takes on indemnities, there's also an obligation to inform Parliament, which we did following those submissions, and whenever we deployed a vaccine, updated those liabilities to Parliament.
The overall approach to indemnities was put to and agreed by the Prime Minister, given the significance and the amount of public money concerned. Why was the DHSC involved in this issue when it was BEIS and the Vaccine Task Force that were leading on the negotiations? Or were you involved because your Secretary of State, Mr. Hancock, was on the ministerial panel?
Yes, I think a few reasons. That is certainly one of them. I think it might have formally reported to both departments from 2020, later in 2021, and for the relevant accounting officer, which at the start was in BEIS, but then transferred to DHSC. That's the issue I talked about ensuring that spend was regular and proper, and indemnities could be informed to Parliament.
When you were briefing your Secretary of State, as is the way with government, you put a handful of hypothetical questions and answers to him for his consideration by way of trying to foresee what sorts of questions the public might ask about what had been agreed by the UK government. And one of the questions which you invited his approval for, in terms of alerting him to what might be said by sectors in the public, was why are you letting Big Pharma get away with the delivery of a potentially unsafe vaccine by protecting them from civil liability? In general terms, were the indemnities agreed by the UK government designed to, or did they, protect the manufacturers from actually being sued in the courts by individual claimants?
No, they were very specific, and I think it was common across most international countries. But at the time we were procuring, it was normal. We had. So it's rare, but for example, we had done the same in the H1N1 swine flu pandemic to, at that time, to offer a limited set of liabilities to the manufacturers that the UK government would take on.
So there was no overarching statutory immunity to the effect of you can't be sued?
Not at all.
There was no guarantee or any provision given by the UK government generally limiting access to the court. It was only about agreeing to pay in the event that a manufacturer lost in the civil courts on a claim perhaps under the Consumer Protection Act, by way of reimbursing the manufacturer for any award of damages made against it and any legal costs in certain circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's right. BEIS and the VTF would be best placed, but that's roughly right.
All right. Moving on to the authorization process.
Yes.
It's well known that in relation to the vaccines authorization process, instead of waiting, which is usually the position, to the end of all the phase 1, 2 and 3 clinical trials for all the data to be given to the MHRA as part of an application for authorization, the MHRA agreed to receive the data as soon as it became available.
That's correct.
A rolling review. Was this course that was adopted something of concern to the DHSC on account of whether or not it would give rise to perhaps unfounded concerns about the degree of rigour or attention being paid to safety issues?
No, the rigour was exactly the same. As you said, it was the speed that allowed, instead of waiting for the entire bundle of information to come to MHRA that would take a number of weeks and months, that the MHRA assessed the information as it was given to them, the rolling review, as you called it, which meant that by the time the final phase 3 trials had been completed and the advice, they'd already looked at what had come earlier. It was exactly the same level of scrutiny and data required for its assessment of safety and effectiveness.
So was there any reduction, as the DHSC saw it, in the amount of time dedicated to clinical trials, or the number of participants in those trials, or the time taken by the MHRA to look at the data and the outcome of all those trials?
No, it was running various assessments and indeed trials that in normal times might run one after another, it was being able to run those concurrently where it was possible. It was also meant that the MHRA, if they had any kind of technical questions about the form in which something had been given, they would talk directly and make sure they understood it, rather than it being a kind of slower to and fro between the MHRA and the company, so that they were able to make the assessments as quickly as possible. The quality and the standard of that assessment was exactly the same. It was the speed and being able to do things concurrently that was different.
Bluntly, the MHRA picked up the phone constantly at all times of the day and night to say what's going on, or what's about this, or where is that document?
Exactly.
What does it amount to? Rather than just waiting in a Delphic silence.
Yes.
To the end of the process,
And then
at the point at which they would be asked to give authorization and have all the material dumped on them.
exactly right.
Right. On the topic of safety, remaining on this topic, the paperwork shows, the documents show that the DHSC was very closely connected to the general debate about the absolute importance of having the MHRA made aware of any safety concerns or issues or side effects appearing from the clinical trial process, as well as the no less important obligation to keep the public and the clinicians and doctors and professionals informed. Is this in reality a very complex structure? Are there a number of different ways in which the MHRA studies vaccines and therapeutics, and of course this system applies to both vaccines and therapeutics, for side effects, for suspected, unexpected, serious adverse reactions, and also a no less complex structure by which it puts all information into the public domain?
Yes, and I know you're hearing directly from the MHRA, but their assessment is both of the trial data, so that is both laboratory data and trials in humans, and their assessment of that. When they come to authorise, they set out any precautions or things that need to be said in the patient information leaflet. They also look at the quality of the actual drug, so they will do regulatory checks at the manufacturers. They batch test each batch of the vaccine before it comes onto the market to make sure that what is being provided is as they were set out on paper. So that's the second tranche. And then, as you say, after deployment, they also do surveillance and monitoring of any side effects that are reported, any other real-life data, so that they are also able to then amend any of the conditions under which they've marketed the product.
And in terms of the conditions, there are formal routes by which the public are kept informed through a document known as a summary of product characteristics, also the patient information leaflets. But the DHSC was obviously aware that the MHRA had a number of different routes by which it kept the public informed in addition. So there were weekly publications of information from the yellow card system.
Yes.
There was something called a drug analysis profile published regularly in respect of every vaccine, and changes made to the medical Bible, the Green Book, and as well as press releases, publications, and the like.
Yeah, in all of those ways.
Was there ever a time in which you, as the Director General of that directorate, or the Secretary of State, or any of the DHSC ministers, perceived that there was information about side effects, or the safety, or the overall safety, or any kind of suspected, because obviously you don't know whether or not a condition is associated with the vaccine, associated with the virus, or coincidental, but any suspected condition was not being put into the public domain?
So in terms of MH being in close contact with MHRA and the experts, also via the Chief Medical Officer and Jonathan Van Tam, knowing what they were doing, the safety signals, which I think MHRA, confident, always reported as soon as they had information. Communicating risk to the public in terms of any change that's happened is a complicated thing to do. So when there were changes on the AstraZeneca vaccine and then on the Pfizer-BioNTech, working closely so that MHRA, the JCVI, and if required, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer could set out that information, not just in writing or on the websites you've said, but in a press conference or whatever was needed. That was brought together if it needed to, so it wasn't just from one individual organisation.
Let me put it another way. Did you or your team or your officials or your colleagues ever have a situation in which they became aware of a specific safety risk or a condition or a suspected adverse reaction in relation to any of the COVID-19 vaccines, which didn't subsequently, following examination by the MHRA and the Commission on Human Medicines and a panoply of government agencies, reach the public domain?
No.
Prioritization. It's obviously a matter of the JCVI primarily, because you've described how your Secretary of State agreed in advance to accept recommendations from the JCVI. But did the DHSC differ significantly or depart significantly from the general approach agreed by the United Kingdom, which was that the priority list had to be based on the essential clinical feature that the oldest were the most vulnerable and had to be vaccinated first, along with care home workers who looked after them?
No, JCVI put out their initial assessment or prioritisation early on in 2020. There were some new, that became more, it was an iterative process about exactly what the groups were, but it remained roughly the same. We were not concerned about that. There was, I'd say, two things. There was quite a lot of debate, publicly and around government about whether different occupations or there should be a different way of looking at it. Other countries also sometimes did different things, so why that was the case. But the JCVI always looked at the clinical vulnerabilities. It was set out in that way, and I think any of the questions put to them addressed that. That age was by far the biggest predictor of serious disease. So I'd say that in terms of the process. I'd also say that there were concerns about how people would react, the population as a whole, to the prioritisation. I'd say because the rollout was so quick, if it had been going on for months and years, I think there would have been more debate. But because it was offered, by Easter to all the over 50s and those clinically vulnerable, and then to all adults being offered a vaccine, really by within 7 or 8 months, I think it also meant that people were confident that not just the prioritisation was correct, but also that the NHS would get through that very quickly and everyone could take up their offer of a vaccine.
And in an overall sense, I think the priority groups were all offered at least vaccination in every country in the United Kingdom by 4 dates in March and April.
Yeah, it was an amazing achievement.
It is self-evident that with respect to a virus which kills the elderly first and most quickly, and therefore makes them the most vulnerable, that any consideration of prioritisation should probably focus on the elderly. But did the DHSC and the JCVI also have recourse to mathematical modelling, which established that if you offer vaccines to the older age groups first, you will inevitably end up reducing the total number of deaths which will be suffered by the United Kingdom?
Absolutely. So the policy intent given to JCVI was to reduce mortality and morbidity as quickly as possible. In doing that, they've had access to epidemiology, clinical information, also modelling. This came into its own also when they looked at the dosage interval early on and decided that the best way to protect the UK population was to get as many people their first vaccine dose rather than prioritising that within the window above second doses.
You've mentioned that the difficult issue of whether or not you interpose particular occupations,
Yep.
put them further up the priority list or put them into the priority list, and we'll ask other witnesses of the pressures that were brought to bear from particular sectors to have their members
Yep.
Vaccinated as a priority. But more widely than that, were there quite acute ethical issues concerning the need to prioritise the vaccination of those who worked in jobs that can't be done at home? Persons in ethnic minority communities, younger adults. There were some quite difficult issues to be resolved. Did the DHSC seek advice from its advisory group, MEAG, the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group, on these issues?
It did, yes.
And do we take it from the fact that the priority list was still age stratified, that by and large, the advice that the DHSC received was that the age approach had to be maintained?
Yes. There were a number of other factors, as you set out. They were very carefully considered by JCVI and others, including our Moral and Ethical Advisory Group. The assessment of the clinical vulnerability was that age was by far the biggest predictor, and so therefore for people in different occupations, different settings, they would have access to their vaccine according to age order, unless they had a health condition that put them in groups 4 or 6, or priority groups 4 or 6 of the JCVI. Care home workers and healthcare workers have been considered and were prioritised in groups 1 and 2 from the start.
And we'll look at that with Professor Lim. And presumably the advice that you received was that if you vaccinate those who are most at risk in terms of morbidity or mortality, those who literally will die first if they're not vaccinated, and the quicker you get through those cohorts, the quicker you will get to the point at which transmission across the country as a whole is reduced and the risks to everybody are indirectly reduced. Is that the thinking?
Yes. For vaccine effectiveness, you both look at the impact on the severity of the disease as well as transmission, and that changed a bit over time with the different variants and the different vaccines, but being able to offer the vaccine to reduce mortality, reduce the risk of hospitalisation by a very large percentage, I think about 80%, both reduced the pressure on hospitals, it saved lives, thousands of lives in that first year and subsequently, and indeed brought down the peaks of the waves of the virus.
There was a particular issue concerning prioritisation, and you've referred to it already, and that was cohort 6, priority group 6. That cohort, that group, had in it a footnote or a reference to carers. And an issue arose as to whether or not in group 6, unpaid carers should be approached on the basis that they were to be included in the definition of sole or primary carer,
Yes.
to which cohort 6 footnote or text referred. Mr. Swinson, the material does appear to make plain that government at some stage and at some point was concerned that if the definition of carer was expanded over much, it would mean too many people being given priority vaccination. At the same time, you were obviously concerned to ensure that the prioritisation groups followed as swiftly as they possibly could. How do you assess that problem was, how well was that problem resolved by the DHSC?
Yes, so when JCVI recommended cohorts or groups to go into the Priority 6, there was then detailed work in the department and in the Green Book, as you've referred to, about the definition of those groups, so defining them, how to define a healthcare worker, how to a carer. There were some ways that was done that were straightforward, for example, being in receipt of carers allowance. There were also a carers register. And I think what then also happened, so that people who weren't registered in that way, if they were the main carer of someone who would be at great risk of COVID-19, that could also be agreed through primary care, through your GP surgery. So defining that cohort and exactly who had eligibility was carefully considered, and the definitions were put in the Green Book.
In hindsight, do you think the government took a too narrow a view of the definition of carers? The upshot was that a very large number of unpaid carers did not receive prioritised vaccination in cohort 6. Well,
Yes.
Was that not an error?
I don't know the numbers, but obviously you were offered a vaccine or the offer was both to sets for carers, but it would also be age-related. So, a relatively elderly carer for an older parent would also have access to the vaccine through the age route. And I think I don't remember it being a large issue, but locally it may well have been, and people should have talked to their vaccination centre. JCVI did set out that there was operational flexibility, so if someone had gone for vaccination with their carer and there was a spare vaccine, because we were very much looking to minimise wastage at the end of the day, there were other ways to make sure that you could get the vaccine.
The DHSC was concerned, it was involved, because although prioritisation was for the JCVI would reach out to the rest of government when there were problems about the meaning to be given to the text or the priority groups, or how operationally it was to be put into practice. Was that why the DHSC was engaged?
Yes, I think that's right. And for both cross-government, but also the response from the public, it was important that there was continued confidence that it was being done in a fair, the rollout was operating in a fair way.
There was a considerable diminution and reduction in confidence amongst that cohort because of this, and it was a problem. There was a real issue as to whether unpaid carers would get prioritised. Do you think?
Can I just interrupt? I'm so sorry.
I'm so sorry.
Keep that train of thought, Mr. Keith. Just going back to, you said that you could go to the local vaccination centre if you felt you ought to be given some priority. But did people know that? I don't think I realised that I think I was in one of the groups that got the jab quite early, but I don't think people knew that, did they?
I was referring really to the operational flexibility that centres did have at the end of the day for healthcare workers. JVT has set out in his statement, for example, when he was vaccinated. The fair and agreed rollout was through the JCVI age cohort, and I think there were very many, big campaigns about both publicly when you were eligible, but also through emails and texts and other ways.
Have you still got that thought, Mr. Keith?
Yes,
I hope so.
Have you lost it?
No, I hope so. I was going to ask you, thank you very much. Do you think that the problem of identifying what type of carer would fall within a particular cohort next time, and obviously the great probability is that the next pandemic and the next viral outbreak will will probably hurt the elderly and those who need care more than most. Do you think there's an argument for reform by way of having a permanent register of carers, whether paid or unpaid, so that in the teeth of a crisis, the government can simply say, well, we know how many people we're dealing with, we can identify the cohort, this will enable us to take a view as to whether or not they should be prioritised easily?
Yes, it is obviously easier to define a cohort when that list already exists, which is the case for healthcare workers. It was the same for care workers, where we asked employers to make sure that all of their employees, because there wasn't a register of paid care workers. As you know, unpaid carers can be a large cohort. Those in receipt of carers allowance are largely unpaid. That's a large number. If there is a way to maintain and to define, a lot of work was put in at the time, but for any group that needs to be defined, if there's an existing register, it makes it simple. And if not, depending on the next, what the circumstances would be, I'm sure there'll be other groups that we'll need to define at the time.
Well, you say a lot of work was done, but the truth is there was no agreement or no decision made to try to draw up a register. Therefore, the public had no means of registering their involvement as an unpaid carer, and therefore nobody knew how many people they were dealing with, and nobody knew whether they were entitled to prioritisation.
I don't know.
If they were an unpaid carer.
Yes, I don't think it would have been no one, but yes, I'm sure that there were people, and I've seen there on the estimates of how big each cohort was and how fast we could get through the cohorts. There were, best efforts for what those numbers would be.
You got there in the end because, of course, the prioritisation process reached everybody in the end, and then everybody, whatever age,
Yes.
got vaccinated or was offered a vaccination. But this was a particular cohort. In order to address the concerns and needs of particular core participant groups in this inquiry, was particular consideration also given through the prioritisation process, but also in terms of operational responses to the needs of migrant people, homeless people, members of the prison population, and in particular, whether or not there should be a carve-out for them specifically within the overarching prioritisation process. So everybody was thought about, even if an exception wasn't made ultimately.
Yes, JCVI looked at very many bits of evidence. There's correspondence I know that you have made available about their assessment for both homeless people and prison workers, and all of that was carefully considered and taken into account in the groupings, that they continue to evolve depending on the evidence.
In relation to children, we're going to target our questions, in fact, to the JCVI and also the CMO and DCMO, because they're the ones who
Yes.
give advice on it. But as it happens, in cohort 6 were also adults aged 16 to 65 who were in an at-risk group. And therefore, the DHSC wrote to the JCVI seeking advice in March 21 on the topic of universal vaccination, so a widening out of the vaccination delivery programme to all under 18s. And your Secretary of State wrote in May 21 formally requesting advice on the vaccination of children and young people. And obviously it was a matter for which he was seeking the view of the JCVI. You, I think personally, wrote again on the 23rd of June. The JCVI, however, didn't respond until the 5th of July 2021, and they gave their quite complex view as to whether or not children and young persons aged 12 to 17 should be vaccinated. Do you know why there was that delay for those persons who were in vulnerable households or who were immunocompromised or clinically extremely vulnerable or clinically vulnerable? They were greatly concerned at the issue of whether or not children would be vaccinated in an attempt to reduce transmission. there appeared to have been some delay. Do you know why that was?
So the evidence for children came later than it did because they hadn't been involved in the clinical trials. It wasn't authorised for under 16s, I don't think, right from the start, or definitely wasn't. There was evidence by the spring of 2020, particularly from the United States and some other places where that could be properly taken into account. And as you've referred to, what happened, I think, for the under 18s is there were a number of steps. It was an iterative process. So first of all, for the 16 to 18s, then for those 12 to 15 with health conditions. From that letter, the universal offer for the 16 to 18s, I think, was recommended in the July, but for the 12 to 15s, that advice then came later in September, which I'm sure you'll come on to. So I think it's not so much that there was a delay in the answer, it was that the answer came in a number of steps according to the evidence, and where JCVI were confident to recommend adding children to a universal programme.
Was the DHSE more concerned in the issue of vaccine uptake and in the process of vaccine uptake than it would normally have been concerned with in respect of routine immunisation? DHSE are concerned about vaccine uptake on the childhood programmes and the impact that has. But clearly in 2021, the government had set out the roadmap out of lockdown and out of the restrictions. One of the tests in that was vaccine uptake, because it was one of the things that would give confidence to reopen society, remove many of the social restrictions and so on. So there was definitely a very strong interest in uptake, both for the protection of individuals, the reduction of mortality, but also for the impact on society and the economy. To what extent did the DHSE and other bodies such as the CMO, DCMO, NHS, Public Health England and so on, and the VTF, consider, and if so, how frequently do they consider how to ensure that barriers to access and inequalities of healthcare service did not prevent the uptake of the vaccines which were being offered? I mean, was this something which you majored on? Was it something that you paid attention to? Were there daily meetings? Tell us how it worked.
Yes, absolutely. So it was known before the pandemic, so we knew when we were planning the campaigns that in all likelihood, because of our experience on routine programmes, the uptake in some groups would be much harder. There'd be harder to reach groups. There were, by the time, we had daily meetings, I think, from November with the Secretary of State, and that covered a range of things on supply, on deployment, and increasingly on uptake. There was Dr. Nikki Kanani, who was appointed in NHS England around uptake for those in harder to reach groups, and that was a very frequent, if not daily, conversation. And the vaccine uptake plan was published in February of 2021 that set out the approach that I can say a bit more about the overall approach.
I'm going to come on to that in a moment. We're going to try not to use phrases like harder to reach because of the connotation that there are groups who put themselves beyond reach. But could you please perhaps have a look at the vaccine uptake plan 0000872330 of February 21. So yes, within a couple of months of the programme commencing. If we look at page 3 briefly, this is obviously a public document. We can see that you say, and this is a departmental document, or at least Mr. Hancock said 6 paragraphs down, we need to ensure that everyone feels the vaccine is for them. For some groups of the population, the intention to be vaccinated is lower. We need to make sure all communities are protected. This vaccine uptake plan sets out our approach. The the vaccine programme had already started. There was a vaccines delivery plan published also by the department, I think a month before, on the 11th of January.
Correct.
But there doesn't appear before January to have been a clear pronouncement by your department that it was absolutely vital to make sure that everything that could possibly be done would be done to ensure that the barriers to access and inequalities were reduced. Why was this not put first and foremost right at the front before you even got going with delivery?
I mean, the times when we published documents, as you say, both in January and February, that was covered. It was definitely part of the discussions, and the Secretary of State had asked NHS England to be ready from the 1st of December to deploy vaccine. Everyone involved in the delivery of vaccines in NHS England and directors of public health would know that different groups needed particular different approaches even when there was a universal offer. So I don't know if I can point to anything in a DHSC document, public document before then, but it was definitely considered right from the start of deployment.
000256951 is, I think, a Public Health England report, which you may have commissioned, but it was certainly, it came to you, and it was actually published right at the end of December 2020, so on the cusp of January. If we could just have a quick look at page 10, paragraphs 2, 3 and 5, we will see that it was well known to the department that there were very, very real difficulties with the data systems surrounding the identification of inclusion health groups, persons who have protected characteristics, certain ethnic minority groups, in particular Gypsy, Roma or traveller communities, or being a migrant or refugee. Because bluntly, as this makes plain, data on certain health groups and protected characteristic groups is variably collected. There's very little data in GP systems relating to the Gypsy, Roma or traveller communities or homeless people and refugees. And there's no easy central data system which collates information on everybody. Just at a very high level, the department was obviously aware of the difficulties, therefore, in trying to find out the lie of the land.
Yep.
Over the course of the 6 months, the first 6 months in 2021, as the vaccine was being delivered, was it actually in any way possible to get on top of these data problems? Were they too embedded, too complex, just too difficult to resolve, so that actually, even by the end of the prioritisation process, nobody really knew how many people were in these communities and how best they could be identified?
So, as a number of witnesses have set out, the situation before a pandemic is likely to be the one that you're in the pandemic. And, you know, for groups that were not registered with a GP, there are a range of things the department did. None of them by themselves would mean that everyone was counted or included. But, for example, being clear that you didn't have to be registered with a GP to receive a first dose, do encourage registration. For example, the homeless at this time, I think, were in emergency accommodation, so being able to, we were able to, or local immunisation teams were able to reach those probably more easily than at some other time. So for some groups it might be easier, for others it might be harder. But the advice and this kind of report would also go to JCVI on the types of things to consider, the types of things that local services could do. As I say, none of them were a kind of one thing you could do to reach all of these people, but a range of things were necessary so that we could be as clear as possible that everyone was eligible for a vaccination.
it's obvious, Mr. Swinson, that much was done by way of, for example, using local trusted figures,
Yep.
reaching out through the press and social media, setting up the community champion scheme. I think your department funded it to the tune of about £25 million in January 21, in order to try to improve or increase take-up. But the appearance is that there were a number of, I suppose, peripatetic or discrete or separate methods used.
Yep.
But none of them were really very effective in terms of increasing trust, reducing distrust, and getting the message out there in a way that made people want to take up the offer of vaccination. The problems with our data systems, with our somewhat fragmented society, were too great for the government to be able to overcome in those 6 months of getting vaccinations out there. Is that a fair summary?
I think that the approach, there is no, you're right, there is no one way to say this is the way to reach all of these groups. I think there's a number of things like the community champion, there is a number of different schemes or approaches that would each make a little bit of a difference that you have to add up in order to make the biggest difference over the course of the year. The approach overall, as I think set out in the uptake plan, is based on the WHO evidence that you need to address confidence. And actually, we did very, there was a lot of data, there were surveys on the reasons people might not, or the barriers to uptake. You need to address confidence, you need to address convenience. So there are very many different routes to getting a COVID vaccine than normal vaccines. And you need to address complacency, whether people think that they need the vaccine. And you need to do action on all three of those in order to drive up the rates as far as possible.
And they're all very difficult
They're difficult
issues.
things to do.
And it's a very complex sphere. There was in England a Vaccines Equality Committee. There was an Equity Committee in Wales.
Yes.
There was also an Equalities Committee within the Vaccines Directorate in Scotland. Did the DHSC have any sort of advisory committee comprising members of the ethnic minorities or disabled people's groups or GRT or migrant or homeless representatives who could say to you, look, this is our community. We know how best you can go about this. Was there any sort of structure or advisory committee that was set up by you that would have helped you?
You refer to the NHS England Equalities Committee. We didn't set up a separate committee, but there were DHSC members of that committee, and both through the daily meetings that Nikki Kanani and others came to, was often, uptake was a regular, and the quality of the data and the speed of the data we had about rollout was incomparably better to previous rollout, so that you could, doesn't answer the question entirely or the issue entirely, but you could say which are the groups and which are the regions, which are the towns, even down to ward level, where you could ask, or NHS England could ask their local communities and directors of public health to focus.
But at the top level,
yeah.
The NHS's Vaccines Equality Committee had, for example, no representative from disabled people's groups or organisations, and not every sectorial group or, to use the terrible terminology, the health inclusion groups were represented on that committee, were they?
I don't have a full list, but I'm sure you're correct.
Probably not.
Yeah.
My lady, we won't finish before lunch, I'm afraid, but I've used this phrase before, we are in the final furlong. Could you consider rising for lunch, and we'll conclude this witness shortly after
No more final
lunch.
furlongs, Mr. Heath. I'm sorry, we had
That's
hoped
okay.
to finish you before Mr. Swinson. I appreciate the next witness is also Cabinet Office. We seem to be denuding Cabinet Office today, but we will finish you quite shortly after lunch, I hope. And I will now break and come back at 2. 2, please.
Rise.